What if Kylo Ren never killed Han Solo? What if instead of falling for Snoke's deception, Kylo was finally able to see through his master's lies and chose to return to the Resistance with Han? This was actually a much bigger possibility than many people may realize, as there was a moment in the movie when Kylo did consider leaving with his father, but ultimately he decided that it was too late and that killing Han Solo was his only choice. But in this video, I will be explaining my theory on what could have happened had Ben Solo returned in The Force Awakens. A lot of what happened in the remainder of the movie still would have been likely to take place. The Resistance still would have destroyed Starkiller Base and returned to the planet of Dakar. But this time, Han would still be with Rey, Finn, and Chewie. The ride back to the Resistance base would be an interesting one, considering Finn's perception of Ben Solo at this point. But I believe that Rey would forgive Ben for what he did during his interrogation, and they would be able to move on rather quickly. When they arrived on Dakar, Han would go immediately to Leia to quietly inform her that Ben was waiting on the ship. Leia, however, would already be well aware of her son's presence and would walk right past Han, boarding the Falcon and embracing her son. The rest of the Resistance would be left in the dark about Ben Solo's return for the time being. At this point in the story, he had certainly done some bad things, but would still be able to fix the galaxy's perception of him over time. After R2 reveals how to find Master Luke, Rey would return to the Falcon with Chewie, R2, and Han. Leia would stay behind to manage the Resistance as they scrambled to move before the First Order arrived. The group would arrive on Ahch-To, and Ben and Rey would climb the mountain together in search of the Jedi Master. Now, Ben Solo's resentment toward his uncle would still be very real at this point. In his eyes, Luke had forced him into the past 6 years of misery he had endured. But we are no longer dealing with Kylo Ren. He is still unstable and somewhat unsure of what he wants, but he is done with the First Order. Finding the inspiration to forgive Luke, however, that would take more time. Luke would be overwhelmed as he turned around to see his nephew standing before him. At first, he would be terrified, but he would quickly accept that Kylo Ren had found him. He had no weapons, and he had closed himself off from the Force. He would accept his fate, turning back around and preparing to be struck down. He deserved it, after all. This was all his fault. Kylo Ren deserved his revenge. However, after what seemed like an hour to Luke, his nephew's voice would break the silence as Ben spoke his uncle's name. Luke would turn back around to face Ben and the strange girl standing by his side. Rey would now speak up, explaining that Ben Solo had returned to the light, and they had come to the island for help. Luke would be in disbelief, but pure instinct would push him to walk in their direction, as tears began to flood his eyes. He would raise his hand to touch his nephew's face, but Ben stepped back, not yet ready to accept this man who had brought him so much pain. But eventually, emotions would overcome the hate and sadness and pain in either of their hearts, and uncle and nephew would embrace each other, forgiving one another for their mistakes in what would have been an extremely emotional scene. Ben's return would eliminate Luke's reluctance to return and help the Resistance. So after returning to the bottom of the island to greet his old friends, Luke would make the decision to train Ben and Rey together for a few days. Ben, of course, would already be well versed in both sides of the Force, but that didn't mean Luke still didn't have plenty to offer him. Rey would progress rapidly over this time, just as she did in The Last Jedi. As she continued to pick up on the abilities Ben had given her access to when she was able to see inside his mind in the interrogation room, Luke would quickly discover the dyad between the two of them, and help them to understand their bond much quicker than what we saw in the sequel trilogy. They would continue to train and study on the Falcon as the group raced back to help the Resistance after sensing that things were about to go very bad. They would board Snoke's ship, and Han and Chewie would race to stop the attacks on the Resistance transports. Ben and Luke would head directly for Snoke's throne room, while Rey and R2 stayed on the Falcon. Rey's potential was undeniable, but she was not ready to face Snoke. Ben and Luke entered the room, but were surprised to find it was empty. A large hologram of Snoke would pop up in front of them as he taunted Luke and Ben, explaining that he had fled the moment he felt Kylo Ren's failure. Stepping aside, he revealed to them that he was also in the presence of a familiar face. The hologram disappeared as Luke was left in utter disbelief. His mind told him it wasn't possible, but his heart knew it was true. "Palpatine is alive," he said. But there was no time to be confused or scared. Han yelled through his comm that they couldn't get past the First Order troopers, and Luke demanded that they return to the Falcon. Rey was already in the cockpit, ready and waiting to take off. Rey positioned the Falcon in between the First Order dreadnought and the Resistance cruisers just as Luke had instructed. As Hux gave the order to fire, Luke reached out with the Force, and Ben was amazed by what he saw. Stopping blaster bolts on solid ground was one thing, but this was something else. Rey, Han, Chewie, Leia, the surviving Resistance fighters, and the First Order all took notice of what was happening. Leia smiled. "Luke," she whispered. The blasts from the command ship were frozen in space, and not just one of them. 10, 20, 30. They continued to accumulate until Hux ordered them to stop, realizing his mistake, but it was far too late. Luke opened his eyes. He had no choice in what he was about to do. With one final push, he sent the blasts back to where they had come from, destroying the ship and saving the Resistance. For now.